Today, I want to talk about how Ken Griffin is the new modern-day Bernie Madoff. I want to explain the striking similarities between Ken Griffin and his alleged fraud company, Citadel Securities, and Bernie Madoff, and how they both escaped the SEC for years. So stay tuned, and let's make some money. And now I want to dive straight in with the key information. So, I want to go through this checklist one by one and compare just how similar Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff really are. First up on the list is the fact that Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff both generated insane profits. And actually, you wouldn't believe it, but Ken Griffin's returns actually outstrip those of Bernie Madoff. So in terms of Bernie Madoff, this article says what's more, these private accounts have produced compound average annual returns of 15% for more than a decade. And remarkably, some of the larger billion-dollar Madoff-run funds have never ever had a down year. Now, generating at least 15% every single year for 10 years in a row, if not longer, seemed very, very fishy to some. And in 1999, financial analyst Harry had informed the SEC that he believed it was legally and mathematically impossible to achieve the gains Madoff claimed to deliver. It says, according to Harry Markopoulos, it took him just 4 minutes to conclude that Madoff's numbers did not add up, and another singular minute to suspect that they were fraudulent. And after 4 hours of failed attempts to replicate Madoff's numbers, Markopoulos believed he had mathematically proven that Madoff was a fraud. Now you may say, Tom, surely Ken Griffin doesn't generate large returns, and especially not every single year. Well, I thought so too, but actually I was wrong. This article from the Financial Times says that Citadel has converted a $10,000 investment in 1990 into $1.3 million. And Ken Griffin's hedge fund's annualised 19.1% return since inception outstrips Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. So hang on a second, it took just 4 minutes for a financial analyst to decipher that Bernie Madoff's 15% returns were instantly fraudulent, but yet Citadel has been returning 19% at least since inception, and yet nobody's batting an eye. If you invested $10,000 into Berkshire Hathaway, you'd now only have $315,000, whereas investing with Ken Griffin would return you $1.3 million. Ken Griffin is over 4 times as profitable as potentially the greatest investor to have ever lived, Warren Buffett, who has generated only $315,000 from a mere $10,000 investment. Now you may say, Tom, surely Ken Griffin and Citadel have some losing years. For example, 2022, right? For example, Tiger Global was down 54.7% this year. 2022 was the year where many hedge funds got absolutely destroyed. We also saw Light Street Capital falling 50% as well amid a tech stock plunge. Surely if this year pretty much every single hedge fund is down, surely Ken Griffin and Citadel Securities are also down as well. What did Citadel fall this year? Was it like 10 or 20%, maybe 40 or 50%, just like Tiger Global and Light Street Capital Partners? Well, actually, the answer would be no. During 2022, a terrible year for hedge funds, Citadel's hedge funds still returned $28 billion, or a 38.1% return. And on top of that, their market-making firm also generated an additional $7.5 billion. So in a year when practically every single hedge fund is down on the year, some hedge funds down even 50% or more, Citadel is somehow on the other side of the fence, up 38.1%. Now, second up on the list is that both Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff had very secretive strategies that they didn't want to tell anyone about. Obviously, Bernie Madoff didn't want to tell anyone about his secret strategy because it just didn't exist. Bernie Madoff wasn't ever trading actual money and never actually had a proper strategy. It was all a Ponzi scheme. As this Barron's article states, when Barron's asked Madoff on Friday how he accomplishes all of these returns, he said it's a proprietary strategy and he can't go into great detail. Bernie Madoff was obviously a very secretive guy because he didn't actually have a strategy, he just made everything up because it was a giant Ponzi scheme. Now you may be saying, Tom, surely Citadel doesn't have a proprietary secret trading strategy and they tell everybody exactly how they make their money, right? Also guys, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel, drop a like down below and ding that notification bell, because that way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Well, actually, a few years ago, Citadel was suing GSA Capital Partners and 5 senior GSA executives, alleging they induced a Citadel employee to supply proprietary and highly confidential information to GSA. It says the secret information allegedly included details of a key Citadel trading strategy, which it says generates many millions of dollars each year. In a lawsuit filed at the High Court in London, Citadel says core features of its trading strategies include algorithms which it invests vast sums in developing and which are highly confidential. So actually, Citadel also has these same secretive trading strategies that they don't tell anyone about. And if anyone tries to figure out what those secret strategies are, they get sued. Okay, so that's both Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff generating insane profits with very secretive strategies that they won't tell anyone about. Now, you may know that Bernie Madoff had both a hedge fund and a market-making arm to his company, and at one point was processing 10% of all trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange. Well, again, Ken Griffin has not only a hedge fund and a market-making arm, but also a dark pool as well, and it uses that to process 40% of all market trading volume. So we can see that actually both Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff supposedly had a hedge fund and a market-making arm and were supposedly processing 40% or 10% of all market trading volume. Now the next part around payment for order flow is actually where it gets really interesting. Bernie Madoff obviously was the founder of payment for order flow. Now, right now in 2022, with Ken Griffin's alleged fraud business, Citadel Securities, Ken Griffin very much advocates for payment for order flow and thinks it's a brilliant idea. And anyone that disagrees with payment for order flow will be voted against in Congress. But actually, interestingly enough, it wasn't always like this. At one point back in 2004, Ken Griffin believed that payment for order flow was terrible for the market and even urged the SEC to ban payment for order flow. I think maybe similarly to Bernie Madoff, at one point Ken Griffin was actually a legit man running a legit business, but then somewhere along the line something changed and Ken Griffin also turned to a life of crime. That is very similar or potentially very similar to Bernie Madoff. Many believe that back in the 70s, Bernie Madoff was making money in a legit way, but then at some point during the 90s, turned to crime. Now you may say, Tom, what could possibly happen that could cause Ken Griffin to change his mind about payment for order flow and could cause him to return to a life of crime? Well, actually, back in 2008, Ken Griffin did have one singular losing year, and hedge fund titan Ken Griffin described the incredibly humiliating moment his firm nearly went under. Back in 2008, Ken Griffin spoke on how he was trying to survive one more day during the 2008 financial crisis and was this close to going bankrupt. Ken Griffin described that moment as incredibly humiliating. And interestingly, back in 2004, Ken Griffin hated payment for order flow, but now absolutely loves payment for order flow, especially after this loss that he took back in 2008. I believe this incredibly humiliating loss changed Ken Griffin's mind, and he decided that if he changes to a life of crime, he never has to have a similarly humiliating moment. If Ken Griffin just changes and simply doesn't ever lose any money, then he won't ever be humiliated. How's best not to lose money ever? Crime. So we're now starting to see there's actually a lot of similarities between Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff, but actually the list doesn't end there. Next up on our list is the fact that both Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff have both paid off Congress or have made significant donations to congressional parties. For example, if we start with Bernie Madoff from 1991 to 2008, Bernie and Ruth Madoff contributed around $240,000 to federal candidates, parties, and committees, including $25,000 a year from 2005 through to 2008 to the Democratic Campaign Committee. Now, if we look at Ken Griffin, on the other hand, he actually has a whole wave of political contributions spanning from 2010 all the way so far to 2020. Ken Griffin has been donating to the Republicans in massive amounts. $3 million here, $3 million there, another $2 million, $500,000, $1 million, and the list goes on. This, I think, was really key to both the Bernie Madoff and to the Ken Griffin fraud. If they both continue to donate to Congress, they never ever were investigated. Obviously, the SEC, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and Congress believed that Bernie Madoff could never commit fraud because he liked us and donated us so much money, and Ken Griffin does the exact same thing. Now, I think this is now more relevant than ever when you factor in the Sam Bankman-Fried fraud. Sam obviously donated tons of money to these political campaigns and was never ever investigated. And in fact, if anything, Gary Gensler and Sam Bankman-Fried were actually best friends. Gary Gensler was even trying to find a way for Sam Bankman-Fried to have a regulatory monopoly. Obviously, the answer is to never get investigated for committing any crimes. All you have to do is just pay off Congress or make some political contributions. It was working perfectly for Sam Bankman-Fried until FTX collapsed. It was working perfectly for Bernie Madoff until his sons turned him in. And it's still working perfectly for Ken Griffin. Because surely nobody that donates money to Congress or to political parties could ever be doing anything wrong and should never deserve an investigation, just like Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, hang on a second. Yeah, he actually did tons and tons of stuff wrong. Now, last on the list, I've written down SEC involvement, and it's not specifically SEC involvement, it's more like regulatory involvement or potential regulatory appointments. For example, members of the Madoff family have served as leaders on the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, the primary securities industry organisation. Bernie Madoff actually served on the board of directors of SIFMA and was chairman of its trading committee. And he was also a founding board member of the DTCC subsidiary in London. Now, Bernie Madoff was obviously very involved in this regulatory oversight, and therefore nobody thought he could possibly be doing anything wrong because he loved regulations, right? And again, we also have Ken Griffin, who wants to be US Treasurer if DeSantis wins his 2024 bid for US presidency. And it says Griffin said he will definitely be involved in the presidential race and won't rule out a move to Washington if called upon, particularly if the US is in a recession. He's prepared to join the cabinet of DeSantis, whom he first met in Citadel's Chicago office during his initial gubernatorial run. And it says one option may be Treasury Secretary. If Griffin runs to be the Treasury Secretary, surely nobody is going to suspect him of committing fraud or running a Ponzi scheme. So I think it's actually scary just how many similarities there are between Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff. And if anything, Ken Griffin is even worse, generating even more insane profits than Bernie was back in the day. And at the same time, many of Ken Griffin's profits came at the exact time as Bernie Madoff's as well. Obviously, Bernie was committing fraud through the 90s up until around 2009, 2010. Ken Griffin's fund, Citadel Securities, started at the very beginning of the 90s as well. Therefore, Ken Griffin and Bernie Madoff were going neck to neck in terms of returns, and Ken Griffin was actually making even more money. But many thought the money that Bernie was making was physically impossible. But seemingly everybody this entire time has been turning a blind eye to Ken Griffin, the real fraudster. But guys, be sure to let me know what you think down in the comments below. And as always guys, be sure to ding that notification bell, because that way you'll be alerted when I put a new video. Cheers!